Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Orinoco Tribune has a piece entitled Coup in Niger, Old Europe on Trial. Gold, silicon, oil, with reserves estimated at 2 billion barrels and above all uranium, are essential for both French nuclear power stations and atomic bombs. They are strategic raw materials for imperialism, which needs to consolidate its dominion at the expense of the southern countries. This is key to understanding the fibrillation provoked in the United States and especially in the European Union by the coup d'etat in Niger. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C. from 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So all of this while the president of Algeria said on Saturday any military intervention in Niger would be a direct threat to his country and is absolutely rejected. He reiterated the support of Algiers for constitutional order and willingness to help return to this order. Some very, very ominous signals being sent by countries that are on the border of Niger, and they're saying to the West, hands off. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, it's not only Algeria. I've been monitoring the Nigerian press and civil society, and it's no accident that the Nigerian Senate and legislature has turned thumbs down on any idea of Mr. Tinubu, the president, sending Nigerian forces into Niger. And keep in mind that in Nigeria, they're up in arms because as they see it, what led Abuja under Mr. Tinubu to try to signal that he was willing to intervene militarily along with ECOWAS, which he is the titular chair of, the Economic Communities of West African States, was a phone call from Vice President Kamala Harris, interestingly enough. And that outraged those who hold Nigerian sovereignty dear. And they also brought up some very curious stories about the Nigerian leader. That is to say that there are documents apparently held closely by the U.S. authorities that implicates him in all manner of improprieties up to and including perhaps money laundering, perhaps even drug dealing. In fact, President Tinubu may be the most affluent head of state in the world today, believe it or not. Now, we know that Nigeria is on course to have a population by the end of the century larger than that of the United States, that is to say more than 330 million. So Nigerian is not a minor league player. It's has the largest economy surpassing South Africa and Egypt on the continent. But still, the fact that this president has accumulated so much wealth, the fact that this president was formerly an accountant for a major U.S. Accounting firm, formerly an executive for Mobil, the U.S. oil giant, that speaks volumes. And also in Nigeria, what has apparently stayed the hand, at least for now, of Abuja, is the fact that there is question in civil society as to whether or not Nigeria can afford an intervention. A previous intervention in Liberia apparently cost billions of U.S. dollars, and they are wondering why billions of U.S. dollars, instead of being used to intervene in Niger, should not go to healthcare and education in Nigeria itself, but perhaps go to repress the banditry that's an outgrowth of Boko Haram. Those are the religious zealots operating heavily in the north of Nigeria. Keep in mind that with the sanctions already biting in Niger, that the cross-border trade between northern Nigeria and Niger has been hampered and hindered, and that is biting northern Nigeria, needless to say. So there are many, many, many questions about this current conflict in Niger. And I should also say that there is concern about the hypocrisy involved. Mr. Tinubu himself does not enter this conflict with clean hands. You might recall the stories of his election just a few months ago, where he made Mr. Trump seem like a piker. Apparently, there were masked men who entered polling booths and grabbed boxes of ballots and stole away with them. There is still contestation in the courts of Nigeria concerning this election. He has not assembled his full cabinet and full administrative team, and folks are wondering whether or not he has been advised sufficiently beyond the advice he received from Vice President Harris. And then there's the hypocrisy of the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, not being more concerned about Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. Recall that its president, Ouattara, with a sleight of hand, extended his term in office to a third term. There were questions as to whether that was legitimate constitutionally. Apparently, there's a tunnel that leads from the president's office in the capital directly to the French embassy. If not, there probably should be, given France's influence in that West African country. And then there are the other neighbors of Nigeria. Look at Paul Biya, for example, in Cameroon. He's been in office for about 40 years. He's almost 90 years old. Now, I should add quickly that he did show up at the St. Petersburg summit, and that raised eyebrows in Washington, so he might be due for another kind of coup. But in any event, folks are wondering why there's not more focus on Paul Biya, particularly when you recall what happened to Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, who had a lengthy term of office and was always under fire because he engaged in land reform that bit into the hides of the European minority in Zimbabwe. And we also know that there's real growing hostility to French neo-colonialism. Folks in Nigeria, and I would say in the region, have long memories. And they recall all too well how France sought to destabilize Guinea-Conakry in the late 1950s when it surged independence by seizing light bulbs, typewriters, toilets even, so that that country would get off on the wrong foot towards independence. Folks have not forgotten what happened in 1947 in Madagascar, the giant island off the southeast coast of Africa that endured French colonialism for decades, when in April 1947, the French forces massacred tens of thousands within a matter of days. And so they also recall that when Nigeria had its own difficulties with the so-called Biafran Civil War, the late 1960s, early 1970s, which almost tore the country apart, France was not very helpful to the federal authorities, to the central authorities. In fact, they were suspected widely of backing the secessionists, along with their cat's paws in Gabon and, of course, in the Ivory Coast. Niger, interestingly enough, stood by the federal and central authorities in Nigeria during that fraught moment. So do not be surprised that perhaps the upshot of all this loose talk about an intervention militarily in Niger may lead to a weakening of the latest placeman of French neocolonialism and U.S. imperialism, speaking of President Tinubu in Abuja. And by the way, his first name is Bola, and of course, he's now being referred to as Ebola as an indication of how he is now being despised because of his jingoism.
Here's an interesting article I'd like to get your comments on. They say, an interesting passage from this article. However, the failure of the neo-colonial security model for the Sahel shows that it is not the security of the citizens that the European military has gone to guarantee, but the EU's own material interest. Talk about how the economic connections between West Africa, Francophone Africa, etc., and Europe, and how this conflict and how these countries getting free from French colonialism has the potential to affect the EU.
Well, it's interesting. The line from Nigerian civil society, progressives, radicals alike, is that the North Atlantic countries are not concerned with the people walking on the ground. They're concerned with what's in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of what's in the ground, they're concerned, of course, about the Nigerian petroleum. They're concerned about the attempt to build a pipeline carrying natural gas from Nigeria through Niger to Algeria to France and the southern neighbors of Algeria. The northern neighbors of Algeria, speaking of France, Spain, Italy, etc. And this pipeline is increasingly being pointed to as the reason for why the North Atlantic countries are so frisky about seeking to at least force Nigeria to intervene. And we've already talked about the uranium in Niger, also in the ground. And speaking of uranium, folks in the United States should be very sensitive to that issue because you've had uranium mining in North America, particularly in the Navajo Nation in the U.S. Southwest, and it has devastated the Navajo Nation. It has led to all manner of occupational safety and health issues. This is in an advanced capitalist country, so you can imagine what uranium mining has done in Niger, which, of course, has harmed the health and safety of countless Nigerians. And then, of course, we all know about the drone base, the U.S. forces on the ground, the French forces on the ground. That's something that Algeria cannot be indifferent to. And there are also wonderment. There's also wonderment in Nigeria, at least on the left, as to why there's not much more concern about the aforementioned Boko Haram, which has been raising havoc in northern Nigeria, kidnapping teenagers, particularly teenage girls, the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, which, interestingly enough, also affects the interests of the North Atlantic nations. Perhaps they are complicit with these pirates. After all, capitalism itself got its start as a piratical enterprise, so perhaps that's why they're so indifferent to that. So there's also wonderment with regard to the role of Saudi Arabia, because we all know that these religious zealots who have been besetting Guinea-Conakry and Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger and northern Nigeria, they're now moving into northern Ghana. Interestingly enough, Ghana has a sizable expatriate Black American community. They're moving into Togo. And of course, we all know that many of the Gulf Arab friends of Washington are heavily invested in supporting these religious zealots. And there's some wonder as to why, in terms of this alleged interest of the North Atlantic countries in fighting this latest chapter in the so-called war on terror, why don't they go through the source, for example, which would be the Gulf Arab countries? So this whole matter of Niger has raised multiple contradictions and, as noted, might lead to the weakening of the already unsteady regime in Abuja of President Tinubu.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.